broad explanatory power. And in fact, people began looking at habitats, not just islands, but they looked at island-like habitats in mainland ecosystems. They began looking at lakes as examples of water islands in the sea of land. Or alternatively, they looked at forest fragments like we have here in Wright State Woods, all 225 acres, surrounded by universities and highways and whatnot. An example of a forest island surrounded by a sea of people. And people began treating these like islands and asking the same kinds of questions. How important is habitat island size? How important is habitat island isolation? And people began finding the same relationships in these habitat islands that they were finding on true islands in oceans. So here's an example of some data on the number of tree species richness. This is logarithmically plotted for about 30 sites. So as the area of those forest fragments increases, the number of tree species found is also increasing, just like you would expect if, according to the size-area relationship. So this ended up leading to a number of principles for designing conservation areas that were derived from the theory of island biogeography. And I've got a couple examples up here that will sort of work through, sort of see what people were thinking. The first basic principle that emerged that was applied in island biogeography to nature reserve design was the idea that larger reserves were going to be better for preserving more species. And we know from the species area relationship, and we know from the relationship between island area and extinction rates, you're going to have more species in equilibrium in a larger reserve compared to a smaller reserve. So just as a general rule of thumb, if you have no other information, no other data to go on, you can safely assume that if you have to choose between a small reserve area and a large reserve area, the large reserve area is going to have more species. A second principle, which was not as immediately apparent, this was sort of really changed the way people began thinking about nature reserves in the 1970s, was that basically one large area was going to be better than 4 small areas that basically added up to the same total area. So if this is 100 acres, and each of those small ones is 25 acres, one 100-acre area is going to be better than 4 25-acre areas. And the rationale was sort of related to, well, you know, the total area is the same, but think about what you would find maybe in a 100-acre area that you wouldn't find in 25-acre areas. You'd find animals that had larger home ranges. So for example, you might be able to have flying squirrels in 100 acres, but they wouldn't persist in 25 acres because it's just not enough habitat for them. And in terms of disturbance events, a 100-acre area in general is going to be less vulnerable to catastrophic disturbance affecting all of it than a 25-acre area. So the general idea was it's better to go with one large than several small. And I'll point out that this ended up being sort of a controversial idea that was debated for about 15 years after first proposed, because there's lots of examples where several small went up the better. The third principle, which derives very clearly from the theory of island biogeography, is that if you're stuck with 4 small reserves, each of 25 acres in size, it's better to have them close together than it is if they're further apart. And this relates back to the idea of the importance of the relationship between isolation and immigration rates. The idea here is if you have reserve areas that are relatively close together, there's the possibility of wildlife or even wild plants being able to make the jump from one of those habitat areas to another, enabling gene flow back and forth, potentially stabilizing populations in the event of that population extinctions and so forth. Whereas if they're far apart and they become more isolated, the number of species you would expect at equilibrium is basically not defined. There are last one I'll sort of mention just briefly, we'll skip reserve shape and buffer zones. Take Dr. Bond's course in conservation biology to get the details there. But the last one is this idea of reserve connectivity. The idea is if there's any way to connect one reserve to another, even in the ways of something small like a greenway or a riparian corridor that would allow for movement of wildlife from one area to another, that's going to be better than having reserves that are functionally isolated. I had a chance to see this particular place a couple of years ago. This is up in Banff National Park in Alberta, Canada. And this is a sort of an example of providing reserve connectivity in the park. There's a major road, a 4-lane highway that runs through Banff National Park. And in a couple places, they have these weird-looking overpasses that go over the road. These overpasses have been placed in critical areas of migration routes for wildlife, so that instead of what used to happen before this was built 20 years ago, you have a large number of roadkills basically taking place in this particular area. That's been greatly reduced because the wildlife has effectively learned to, rather than go out on the road, they can travel over the road on this bridge basically designed for wildlife. Okay. So this has helped provide connectivity. It's basically at least eliminated the road as a barrier to some extent for some species here. And that connectivity sort of helps increase the overall immigration rate. When that immigration rate increases, that's going to increase the number of species you have.
Did it reduce roadkill?
It did reduce roadkill. And in fact, these kinds of things, which are now you can find become a lot more common. They seem very weird and very hard to sell. The Department of Transportation's both in the US and Canada and in places in Europe. It's always the crazy person in the agency that sort of proposes it, but once people look at the data, they're like, wow, this actually works. Then they propose and the public says it's a crazy idea. But then they do a demonstration project and they're like, wow, this